Hello, everyone. I'm Sibel Edmonds. I'm going to provide some general synopsis of my case. I know some of you are very familiar with my case, but then there are some of you who are somewhat familiar, and we may have some new viewers here, maybe more than a few, who have never heard of my case or my background. So allow me to start with just a short, brief overview of my case. I know it's been a long time. In fact, it has been 16 years since my whistleblowing journey began with the FBI. So bear with me and hopefully we can make this short and sweet. I worked for the FBI in 2001, right after 9/11. I worked for several departments for the FBI's Washington field office. This is in Washington, D.C. I worked for 3 different departments, to be exact. I worked for counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and also I did some work for the criminal division. There are various divisions within the FBI. And even though I started as a language specialist with the FBI, I speak 4 languages, including Farsi and Turkish and Azerbaijani. Fairly quickly, within 2 months after I started, they asked me, and these are the special agents that I worked with. Some of them were in Washington, D.C. field office. Some of them were in other field offices, such as Chicago and Patterson office in New Jersey, LA office in California. Pretty soon, these agents asked me to perform not only translations for them, but also actual analysis. This was due to several reasons. The FBI's field offices, they didn't have any Turkish analysts or any analysts from Central Asia, Caucasus region. And I was not planning to be a language specialist. I have a master's degree in public policy. I have degrees in criminal justice and psychology. And I was intimately familiar with the politics in Turkey, in Iran, because I had lived in those countries. So I could perform mainly analysis for a lot of raw intelligence that the agents were gathering on minutely basis from various sources and targets. I also had highest level security clearance because I had access to the most, or what the FBI considered the top classified information. And again, these were from both counterterrorism division and also from the counterintelligence division. So without getting into too many details, I know some of those details I can't get into because of the ultra classified nature of this information. And I have to also emphasize that some of this information, raw intelligence, were justifiably classified, while there were others that should not have been classified in the first place. The only reason they were classified was so that this information would be kept out of the public's eye. And many of this information involved actual criminal operations activities performed, executed by various U.S. agencies, both in the United States and also outside the United States. Within a few months after I started working with the FBI, I came across some very significant information and consequent cover-up of those various categories of information. And unlike what many people believe, I didn't get out of the FBI building, go to some press office and leak documents. I didn't even know it was called whistleblowing. In fact, I decided that it was my obligation, even based on documents I had signed with the FBI, that it was my duty, my obligation under my contract to report these issues to the higher management, which I did. When no actions were taken, not only that, the only actions that were taken involved retaliation against me, and this was mandatory forced polygraph test. In fact, they had a troop of 7, 8 agents storming my house and confiscating my home computer, my PC. My husband at the time worked from his home office in our house. They confiscated my husband's computer. I decided that, well, that outlet, that channel was absolutely futile, pointless to pursue. So I went to the United States Congress. Because if you are familiar with U.S. laws and policies, You know that they present these so-called appropriate channels for the whistleblowers, for people who are reporting wrongdoing, go to, and in a safe environment without jeopardizing any classified information, to report whether it's waste, whether it's fraud, whether it's abuse, or in this case, criminal deeds performed against the United States national security and against the international laws. It was at that point that I found out for the first time, really, because at that point in 2002, we didn't have many cases of whistleblowers, that I was labeled, I was called, they referred to me, whether in Congress or IG offices or the attorney offices that I went to, that people like me were called whistleblowers. And it was a name, it was a title that was really unsavory for me, because my reaction was, I am reporting urgent criminal operations, criminal deeds, and subsequent cover-ups by certain U.S. agencies and by certain U.S. officials. Some of these officials were elected representatives. Some of these officials held high-level positions within the executive branch, such as the State Department and Pentagon. And some of these individuals worked for, I call them in-between agencies, not exactly governmental agencies, but entities that worked with the U.S. government, inside the U.S. government, such as RAND Corporation and various think tanks. By mid-March 2002, I was officially, you may call it, a whistleblower. And the retaliation level from the FBI and the Justice Department against me increased tremendously. In fact, by the end of March 2002, they removed my security clearance and they denied access. They denied me access to all these files and the cases I was working on. Eventually, by mid-April 2002, I was terminated. I would call it, I was fired, but because I was a contract employee, they called it termination of contracts without any reason cited. Within 6 months after that, after I was terminated, to be exact, on October 18, 2002, the Justice Department, at the time the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, invoked this thing called executive action called state secrets privilege in my case, which basically said, I can't go to courts, I cannot go and talk about any of the angles or the information involved in my case. And pretty much it is a type of a gag order. And it was a rare executive privilege invoked up until that point within the history of the United States. This law has never passed the Congress or the courts. It's an executive law based on common law that was rarely practiced in the United States. I was one of the first 3 or 4 people in the United States to receive that invocation, the state secrets privilege, which is a severe gag order. The government went further than that. They went to Congress, and this is the Justice Department, in 2002, and they told the congressional offices, both in the Senate and the House, these were from offices from appropriate committees with jurisdiction over the Justice Department, State Department, CIA, basically law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And they told them to cease investigating my case. They told them to basically clean up their computers and make sure they destroy any documents they had obtained during the investigation of my case. There were several offices that actually actively investigated my case. One of them was Senator Leahy, Democrat from Vermont, with the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. The other one was a Republican, Senator Chuck Grassley. They jointly opened an investigation in my case. They actually summoned people from the FBI and began collecting testimonies. And interestingly, the agents I worked with, those witnesses, they all corroborated my case, because none of these wrongdoings that I had witnessed and I had reported were due to some of the field agents operating. The agents I worked with, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, These were street level agents and they were doing their jobs. These deeds were committed from the highest level offices within the FBI, highest level offices in the State Department, and particular divisions within the CIA and the Pentagon. This was the first time that the United States Congress was officially gagged by an executive branch. In fact, constitutionally, it is impossible for the executive branch to issue a gag order on another branch, such as the judiciary or legislative branch. And again, interestingly, these congressional offices, they didn't challenge this illegal, unconstitutional order. They went about implementing it, meaning they ceased making comments on my case to the media, which they had done in the past. They have vouched for my credibility, the credibility of the case, the fact that my case and my allegations were all confirmed by insiders, and these are various senior level agents within the FBI. These congressional offices actually abided by this unconstitutional gag order, and they cleaned up their computers and they destroyed any documents they had obtained in my case, regarding my case, from various witnesses. Not only that, within a year or so after all this, the United States government, the Justice Department, invoked the state secrets privilege for the second time in my case. The state secrets privilege has never been invoked twice on the same person, but in this case, they did. So what did I do? After exhausting the congressional channel, pursuing the congressional channel, after pursuing the executive offices supposedly in charge of receiving these types of wrongdoing reports, such as the Inspector General's office, I began pursuing my case in courts. Well, every single one of my court cases, whether my case filed with the courts under the First and Fourth and Fifth Amendment, or the case under FOIA laws, because my attorneys and I, we requested documents from the government and they were obligated to release some of these documents. But they did not. They violated the FOIA laws, and FOIA laws refer to Freedom of Information Act, meaning there are certain documents that people, the public, are entitled. They are entitled to receive. And again, even though they kept citing classification issue, many of these documents were not classified. This time around, the government stepped in and they told the courts that no matter how factual my case, no matter how strong my case, I could not pursue my case in the courts of law. They said the information I knew about, I had witnessed, I had gathered while I was working inside the FBI were so incredibly classified, were so sensitive in nature, that even hearing my date of birth, where I went to school, where I was born, would jeopardize our national security and the classified nature of what I knew about. In fact, under Judge Reggie Walton's court, this is a federal court in Washington, D.C., the government stepped in and asserted that my date of birth was classified and considered state secrets. Where I had attended schools, these included universities and colleges I had attended in the United States, were all classified and they were covered by state secrets privilege. They said where I was born was covered by the state secrets privilege, and the languages, every single one of those that I spoke and I was fluent in, were considered sensitive material, sensitive information, and therefore classified and covered by the state secrets privilege. Of course, I didn't give up, and I kept pursuing the courts. I went to the appellate courts. At this time, the ACLU, because my case had begun receiving some level of publicity, stepped in and they represented me. So we went to the appellate court. Again, it was blocked by the government assertion of the state secrets privilege. And then we took our case, my case, all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. After that one last court channel, meaning the Supreme Court, That channel was exhausted because, again, they were prevented from hearing my case. I had basically exhausted all governmental channels: Congress, the executive branch, and the courts. By 2004, after finding out, despite my degrees in public policy and US politics, I had no idea what was truly the true functioning of the US government. I truly believed in the separation of branches and all those stuff. But with this knowledge, I formed my own organization without registering it as an NGO. And I started gathering other national security whistleblowers who have gone through retaliation. I also started pursuing the fourth state, in this case, the media, and tried to get the media to investigate this case. So much had already been made public by the congressional channels. So much had been made public by other witnesses within government agencies that had come forward and corroborated my allegations. But none of these media channels, and at the time, most of them were mainstream media. There were some alternative medias, or the so-called supposed alternative media outlets out there as well. None of them covered my case except one aspect of it. And that aspect was, here is the victim. Look how badly government retaliated against her. This is what the government does to people who dare blowing the whistle. They lose their jobs, they get to be hooked on polygraph machine, they get to be, basically their lives are destroyed. They wanted to limit the reporting on this case that became known as the most gagged case, the most gagged person. In fact, the ACLU from 2004, after going and searching the entire case histories under the law in the United States history, they came out and they said, I was the most gagged person in the history of this country, pretty much 300 years. But no, the media didn't want to have anything to do with why this was the case. Why someone who worked with the FBI, in the FBI, less than a year, would become the most gagged person. What kind of information did she report, did she come across that the government is so afraid of? Not a single media outlet pursued that line of inquiry or that line of investigation. By 2007, there I was. All my court cases were over. There was no sign of having any congressional hearing because Congress was officially gagged on my case. And I had come to this realization that we as a nation did not even have a real media, a real independent media outlet, not even one in our nation. Can you believe that? It was around this time, the end of year 2007, beginning of 2008, that I decided to publish a list, a web page with a bunch of pictures of various people. I call this my state secrets gallery. I was gagged from speaking and naming any individuals involved in my case. I was gagged officially to talk about any information I had come across that was criminal in nature because they classified it. They have the power to classify it. But I was not gagged from publishing pictures. So I published this list with the pictures of 24 or so US officials. Some of them from the executive branch, some of them from the Congress. These were the elected representatives. And some of them from these in-between agencies. If you look at this state secrets privilege list, you'll see that it is divided based on 3 categories. At the top, you see the names and the pictures, and I did not name them. Other volunteers, researchers, and activists actually went out and found names to list and put out with the pictures. All I could do at that point was putting out pictures, being under this gag order. So you see the first category, and these are the executive branch officials who were directly involved in my case, in those criminal operations that I blew the whistle on. And if you scroll down, you would see the legislative branch, and you see these U.S. representatives, the elected officials. And as you can see, there are Democrats and there are Republicans. Same with the ones above. And if you keep scrolling down, you come to the third category. And those are the ones who are in between governmental and non-governmental agencies. Now let's go back to this list again, and let's go back to second category. I mean, you see individuals like Tom Lantis. Of course, you see Dennis Hastert there. There is a box there with a question mark. There is no picture there. Today, I want to talk about who this box belonged to, why it had question mark to start with, and why it's time, now it's the time to expose who this person is and why he or she was included on this list in my state secrets privilege gallery. I'm going to start with explanation why initially I put a question mark there. Around middle to end of February, this was right around the time when I had reported these wrongdoing to the FBI officials in higher offices. These were called SES, Senior Executive Level Offices. During this period, the agent, the special agent I worked with in Washington's field office, had contacted another agent, and this person was a special agent in charge in Chicago, FBI's Chicago field office, and had told him about me and the abilities I had from speed reading to analysis, and had asked him to consider using me for a very, very important investigative files that these two agents had previously jointly worked on. This agent, special agent in charge in the Chicago's field office, his name was Joel Roberts. And the urgency for him to send these documents, these files to me, was that as it had happened before during the Clinton administration, with the Bush administration as well, the executive branch was trying to kill this investigation and shut it down. Therefore, they needed to gather more damning, conclusive evidence against the targets of their investigations. And their investigations involved both Americans, in this case officials, and foreign entities and foreign operatives. So the special agent in charge, Joel Roberts, called me up and said he had sent me via secure channels 7 random documents from one particular investigative file. He wanted me, and again, the date range for these documents gathered was from late 1998 until 2001. He asked me to very quickly, as fast as I could, to go through the material, including foreign language recordings, and give him a quick feedback and analysis on what I had found to be pertinent and why. Basically, it was his way of testing me and see if I were as good as the agent I worked with had bragged about. I went through these random files, individual files, including audio files, and including audio files that were in other languages. And immediately I started typing up my report on very pertinent information that I was listening to. A couple of days later, the special agent in charge, Joel Roberts from the Chicago field office, set up a conference call, scheduled a conference call via secure lines in the FBI's Washington field office and Chicago office, and asked me to tell him during this conference call what I found to be the most important and why. The counterintelligence agent I worked with in the Washington field office was also present, and his name was Dennis Sasher. from Washington's Fields office during this conference call. And I gave my report verbally to the agent in Chicago, Joel Roberts. And I said the most significant information here has to do with this U.S. representative. His name is John. And from all the training I had received before analyzing counterintelligence files, certain foreign entities were in the middle of hooking this particular U.S. representative whose name is John. During my training, I had been instructed on important phrases, words, and methods where foreign operatives, or in some cases criminal operatives, hooked U.S. government officials, whether they are in Congress or whether they're in the executive branch. It's a very interesting process. It starts out very smoothly. In most cases, the people who are target, let's say the officials, they don't even realize that they are being hooked. Maybe it starts with small favors. Maybe it starts with, receiving certain gifts. But it usually starts very smoothly and something that may not jump at people as, oh, this may be for nefarious reasons. And from that point on, slowly, the hooking process gets faster and it gets to be more serious. And by the time the target realizes what had taken place, it's already too late. He or she has been hooked. So during this conference call, I told the agent, I said, well, this guy, this U.S. representative, John, is being hooked up by a woman. I'm assuming he may be married by a foreign woman, and the targets were discussing how to videotape, audio tape, and basically gather and monitor everything so they could use this John, his relationship with this woman. And considering that he's a representative, and at this point, I didn't even know if this person, the American, the official, was a representative in the state legislative branch or what it was in Washington, D.C. All I had, and this was on purpose, this was kept from me on purpose by the agent because I was supposed to pass the test or not. So I explained all that, and the agent chuckled, the agent in Chicago. So that's very good. However, I'll have to tell you, this person that you're talking about is not named John, it's Jan. See, because in various languages that I speak, those languages are gender neutral. So we don't have his or her or she or he. There is either a name or it is something like it. Okay, so for me, all I heard was, and this was by accented individual, John. So I assumed this congressional person was a man named John. Well, it was because of their accent. They were talking about a congresswoman in Washington, D.C., and her name was Jan, short for Janice. He had caught me off guard because I said, well, that's interesting because the hooking up process, they are using this woman, and this is her name, and this is her nationality. I was puzzled for a second. And then I was told that, yes, this person, Jan, was married, but it was a fake marriage. It was not a real marriage. And in fact, she was a closet lesbian. And these foreign entities, this was not the first time. They had in the past used female baits to hook her, including certain people who worked in her office before she came to Washington, D.C. Anyhow, obviously I had passed the test because the next morning when I reported back to work, I came back to my office. I saw that the special agent in charge from Chicago had sent me what he referred to the motherlode file. This file went dated from 1998 till 2002, and it contained over 5,000 documents. Now, some of these documents were audio in nature, and each one could be anywhere in terms of length from 200 minutes to as short as 1 minute. And looking at this file and the size of it, I kind of panicked and I said, I mean, this is a huge file and I have other assignments because I'm working on counterterrorism cases. I'm working on the cases that are directly related to Washington, D.C. office. And the special agent in charge said, no worries. This is the most important case right now you're working because it involves Chicago. It involves several officials. And they, and by they, he meant the White House. And at the time, it was the Bush administration. They are going to shut down this investigation and stop us from monitoring these people, these criminals, in the next 2-3 months. So I'm going to talk with your superiors and I want to make sure you're given enough time to work on this case. So I began working on this case furiously, and I started discovering some amazing espionage-related activities, criminal-related activities, not only by this particular target, but other U.S. officials, and not only U.S. officials, but also this congresswoman's husband. However, within 2-3 weeks, the retaliation that I had mentioned began taking effect. And a few weeks after that, I was terminated. By the time I was done with the FBI's Washington field office, or a more accurate way of putting it, I was fired, I had time to only go through 15 or 20% of those files. Another interesting point, as I started working on these files, I found out that a similar file involving the same congresswoman and her husband was also being investigated under FBI's Washington field office Israel desk. You see, the Washington field office for the analyst and the language specialist had 400, 500 people working in. And it was divided to based on target countries. You had the India desk, Pakistan desk, Israel desk, Turkey desk. In fact, Turkey was one of the only one of the only 3 countries that were exempted until 9/11. The FBI was not allowed to have an official Turkish desk for its counterintelligence because Turkey's direct involvement in the Operation Gladio related activities, both with NATO and also the State Department and the CIA. The other country that's been exempt is the United Kingdom. England is exempt. There is no desk for England. And the third country exempt from counterintelligence investigations by the FBI is Belgium. After 9/11, due to what had happened and due to certain actors that had ties or connections to various countries, including Turkey, basically they decided to override it and they started the Turkish desk, but they never started a UK or Belgium desk in the FBI's Washington field office counterintelligence division, which is the largest, the main counterintelligence division for all FBI offices in the country. Everything is handled from the FBI's Washington field office. Now back to why the question mark. When I decided to put the pictures in this page that is called Sibel Edmonds' State Secrets Gallery, I had to really think hard about it. I had not finished going through the entire file for this woman, and this woman being Congresswoman Jan Tchaikovsky from Chicago, and her husband, another target of investigation, Robert Creamer, usually goes by Bob Creamer, and other state representatives in Illinois and other executive branch government officials in the state of Illinois that were involved in high-level criminal operations that ranged from narcotics, money laundering, and in this case, also espionage-related activities. Before I was terminated from the FBI, I had tried to obtain more information from the Israel's desk in the Washington field office, telling them that I was also working on a counterintelligence matter that involved the same congressional woman, and that it would be beneficial. You know, at the time, especially after 9/11, everybody was talking about information sharing between intelligence agencies or various departments. In fact, many US officials blamed the failure of intelligence agencies' operational style, which was not really the case. The fact that they were not sharing information, the fact that they were being territorial. Well, in this case, they told me that a lot of that information they could not share with me because it was based on need-to-know basis. However, they could provide me with general information which had to do with this congresswoman, Jan Schakowsky, and her role that she had been playing for the country of Israel through her handlers who were part of the top two lobbying group in the United States. And the role they had set up for this congresswoman was to pretend that she was pro-Palestinian and to cozy up to various activist groups and entities as not anti-Israel exactly, but pro-Palestinian, someone who speaks against Israel's actions or atrocities, etc. And under that role, she would gain access to information, and that would pass it on to officials in GINSA and AIPAC, and those lobby group people then would send the information to their handlers, I assume to be in Israel. Not only that, this congresswoman had access in the US Congress in Washington, D.C. to high-level classified secret documents because she also played some role with the Intelligence Committee. Even though she was not the higher-up level, she had access to top-secret US intelligence information. Well, this information that she had access to was beneficial to several countries. Israel was one of them. Back again to the State Secrets Privilege Gallery. I kept debating. I did not finish all the files. For example, I didn't get to the point where these foreign entities were actually getting stuff based on blackmailing. I had already gone through the section where they were gathering material to further pressure and blackmail her, but I had not gone to the end of the file. So at that time, I decided to put just a question mark. And at this point, I also want to emphasize the fact that I have never been either a Democrat or Republican. In fact, until I was fired from the FBI, I didn't even know who Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky was. I had never dealt with her office. I have never known her. I have never met her. I got to hear her voice a lot, but I never had anything to do with this woman. So it was not like right now, it is not as if right now I'm talking about someone that I have some sort of a vendetta or beef against. And that is true with every single individual and pictures you see on this State Secrets Privilege Gallery. I have never met these individuals. I have never had personal or business relationship with them. The only reason they are there, it's because it is a fact that they are involved in criminal operations. They had been involved in criminal operations for many, many years. And it was and is for the purpose of the public's right to know. Once I published my state secrets privilege list in late 2007, I did not think about Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky that much. But that came to an end. In 2009, I was officially deposed by a party who was involved in a court case. The party in this case was Krikorian, and the person who was in this legal lawsuit against him was Congresswoman Jane Schmidt. At least I remember her last name being Schmidt. But for this case, the candidate who was running against Congresswoman Schmidt deposed me. So I had a court order and I was obligated to go and provide my testimony under oath. Initially, the FBI and the Justice Department tried to block my testimony. They wrote and they sent this letter, this order that came in the form of letter saying that she's not allowed to testify. However, my attorney said, you can't do that under the laws, under the Constitution. All you can do is, and this is the FBI and the Justice Department, you can be present during her testimony and you can raise your hand and object and say, no, we are not going to let her answer this question. I challenged all that and I went under oath and I provided my 3+ hours testimony for the court case in Krikorian versus Schmidt case. During my testimony, the other party, Congresswoman Schmidt's party, was represented by the infamous and famous Bruce Fein. So between Bruce Fein and the attorney for Krikorian, I was being asked many questions, and some of those questions ended up coming to Chicago. Being under oath, not having the FBI or Justice Department people present there to stop me, and knowing that I was not going to divulge any information that was legitimately classified, I answered every question truthfully. And that included the questions that had to do with Chicago.
We've talked about some members of Congress having connections with the Turkish government or Turkish organizations. Are there others that you're aware of, other than the ones we've discussed already?
Congressional members?
Congressional members?
Yes. There's an individual with a question mark there. The reason it's a question mark is I was terminated by April 2002, but this particular congresswoman, these Turkish organizations and operatives, if they can't do it via money, they do via blackmail. So they collect information on sexual lives and other information like that. Mm-hmm. And with this particular congresswoman, between 2000 and until I left, this congresswoman is married with children, grown children, but she is bisexual. So they had sent Turkish female agents, and that Turkish female agent worked for Turkish government, and had sexual relationship with this congresswoman in her townhouse actually in this area, and the entire episodes of their sexual conduct was being filmed because the entire house, this congressional woman's house, was bugged, and so they had all that documented to be used for certain things that they wanted to request, but I left, so I don't know whether that congresswoman complied and gave. That's why I couldn't use her name, because her face, because I don't know if she did anything illegal afterwards. But information was being collected for blackmail purposes and her lesbian relationship, and the Turkish entities wanted both congressional related favoritism from her, but also her husband was in a high position in the area, in the state she was elected from, and these Turkish entities ran certain illegal operations and they wanted her husband's help. But I don't know if she provided them with those. I left, I was terminated.
And during this testimony, this recorded, both videotape and audio, I provided my testimony on a congresswoman who was engaged in espionage activities, who was engaged with her husband in nefarious criminal-related activities, and who was a closet lesbian, who was being blackmailed or being recorded by various entities, including foreign entities, for blackmail purposes and for espionage activities-related purposes. But even then, based on the fact that I had not gone through the entire 5,000 documents, I did not name the congresswoman during this testimony. I talked about Chicago, I talked about her husband being prominent, I talked about her sexual orientation and how it was being used by people who had nefarious purposes. But thanks to some independent activists and investigative journalists, not with any of the US mainstream media or so-called alternative media, within a couple of days, her name was leaked. They found out, well, how many congresswomen do you have from Chicago with a politically prominent convicted husband? Bob Creamer is a criminal who was convicted and jailed for almost $3 million embezzlement cases. And he is a name that has been present and very prominent within Chicago and actually Illinois politics. In fact, Bob Creamer was the handler, the campaign manager, the consultant, the top advisor of all the criminal Chicago, Illinois political figures who ended up either in jail or they were exposed for their criminal operations. Jan Tchaikovsky's husband was not only a thief who embezzled the public close to $3 million, but he's also the man who worked with criminals such as Mayor Daley of Chicago, such as Governor Blagojevich, such as Tony Rasko. In fact, it was Bob Creamer, Congresswoman Jan Tchaikovsky's husband, who groomed and trained Rahm Emanuel, who ended up being President Obama's chief of staff when he got elected. Therefore, it was not too difficult for people who were really pursuing and looking into this case to put the 2 and 2 and 2 together and come up with the solid 6, which in this case was the person Sibel Edmonds testified under oath, which I would be jailed. I would have been jailed had I not told the truth, had I lied about this, was actually Congresswoman Janice Tchaikovsky. Interestingly, and maybe not so interestingly, the mainstream media proved to be consistent once again. Even though my attorney offices had sent a press release that FBI was trying to prevent this deposition, and even though I had testified and revealed some very significant information on criminal U.S. officials, which included Dennis Hastert, and of course, in this case, Janice Tchaikovsky, Tom Lantis, Bob Livingston, Richard Pearl, Douglas Speed. Not a single media outlet showed up, and not a single media outlet, mainstream media outlet, covered this case. I have to give the credit where it's due. The only publications that printed this and publicized this was, one of them was the American Conservative Magazine. And they did a very courageous job of putting a lengthy, comprehensive article. In fact, it became a cover story. I was on the cover page. I believe it was titled, "Who's Afraid of Sibel Edmonds?" where I talked about and I confirmed that, yes, in this particular Congresswoman case, this was Jan Tchaikovsky, and her husband, Bob Creamer, is also not only the fact that he was convicted of this embezzlement, he was involved in mafia-related activities that involve narcotics, money laundering, and in some cases, espionage. And the other one was an independent site ran by an activist called Brad Friedman, Brad Blog. Brad Blog, again, I'm always thankful for the fact that he sent the cameraman there. He published my deposition in full, which was 3 hours worth of videotape. And then he went and he sought comments from Jan Tchaikovsky's office, which her office denied. But at the time, after they issued this non-denial denial and attacked my credibility, I stepped out and made a public call. I put an official letter that was delivered. It was a certified letter, and I also had it published on my site, and I gave it to any media outlets who wanted to have it. And basically, in my letter, I invited the Congresswoman to join me in a congressional hearing under oath, where I would testify, name the dates, name the names, name the files, offices, everything, on all her deeds, including the interns that she put in office who were actually spying for foreign governments, that I would be willing to do that under oath if she would join me and take a stand under oath and challenge and deny it under oath. She refused. She said she would never do that. I also issued another invitation to her. I said, I am willing to take a polygraph test on this, okay, via independent polygraph experts, if she's willing to submit to a polygraph test. And again, I issued this and I stood by it, and she refused. And from that point on, they never responded to any inquiries that came to their office about my expose on Congresswoman Schakowsky's. After all this, with her name becoming public in my case, but after I started my own website, my own news site, at the time it was Boiling Frogs Post, and through some of my other sources who used to work with various intelligence agencies, I began looking into Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky closer. Sure, I did no longer have the access to the remaining 80% of those 5,000 plus documents, intelligence documents. These were hard facts and evidence establishing this Congresswoman and her husband as criminals. But there were plenty out there, both on her and her husband, showing who these people were about. Yet these people, Jan Schakowsky and her husband, as if by some sort of a pact, were given immunity, not only by the United States Congress, but also by the US media, and especially by the media outlets operating in the state of Illinois. Another interesting point I want to quickly make here is, before Jan Schakowsky, I had come out with a major expose on Dennis Hastert. He was at the time the Speaker of the House, Republican, the third most important man in the US politics. After President, the Vice President is the Speaker of the House. I'm going to get into that case a bit later, but when I came out with the expose on Dennis Hastert, sure, the media, the mainstream media, they ignored it. They blacked it out. And so the same goes for the so-called alternative channels, many of them. However, I did not receive any personal or vicious attacks by the Republicans, or what people refer to as right-wing people. They didn't come and say, you are disgusting, despicable, you must be a Democrat, damn liberal who's going after Republicans by doing this. After all, your case came out under Bush, so you're a closet liberal Democrat who's going after the Republicans. There was absolute silence, but there were no attacks. It was the opposite when I started exposing the Democrats involved. Because if you look at the state secrets gallery, you see they're both parties. It's not a partisan case, my case. It's never been a partisan case, right? When this information went out on Jan Schakowsky, when I stood there and I told the truth, when I confirmed to the media once her name was leaked, I have to say I received the worst, the most vicious attacks from the so-called left activists, the liberals, the Democrats. I have never been called the names I had been called. The outlets that were bashing me and calling me the names that I don't even know how the internet even allows that language to be published included despicable sites like Daily Kos, Democratic Underground. Democracy Now! Pledged that they would never ever invite me on. In fact, I was called the B word, bitch. People who became famous after working for Democracy Now!, such as Jeremy Scahill, they went onto the social media and called me traitor, repug, someone who doesn't know what she's talking about. Now, interestingly, bear with me, these same people, Democracy Now!'s Israeli Amy Goodman, Jeremy Scahill, all of them, Daily Kos, when I initially my name became public in 2002, 2003, during the Bush administration, when I revealed the case of Dennis Hastert as a criminal official who had been under investigation since 1998. These people were my biggest cheerleaders out there. Go and look at the archives for Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Okay? You will see that I had been on her show at least 3 times, 3 or 4 times. You would see these threads. I would ask people to go and look into Daily Kos or Democratic Underground and all these liberal websites and the Salon and whatnot. And you will see articles, a courageous whistleblower, and everything that she's standing against has to do with the Republicans. And because she's being gagged by the Republicans, let's throw our weight and be her cheerleaders, because we can go ahead and give this finger to the Republicans. That was the only reason. They were not cheering for me because of all the things that I would. It was just a matter of partisanship. Well, I didn't receive the same thing after 2008 when Obama came to office. And when I was putting out all these names, and some of them were Democrats, I didn't receive before that from the Republican side. So it's to me, it's a significant point that is worth emphasizing here, and to see which side is more inflicted with the disease of rabies, which one is actually more violent, and which one controls the media most. And I have to be frank here. You can go and look at their archives from 2008 after Obama got elected. You will never see me or my name being mentioned by Daily Kos, Democratic Underground, Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, PBS, NBC. At that point, I was equal evil. They didn't have anything, didn't want to have anything to do with me. They didn't want to have anything to do with me. They just wanted to bash. That was all it was about for them, partisanship. So I'm going to go back again and emphasize not only this woman, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, but also her husband. I already listed the names of criminals he served. Now, interestingly, just a few months back, this expose came out showing this convicted criminal, this man who's the major figure within Chicago Mafia. This is the man who was jailed. This is the man who worked with all the criminal politicians who were either jailed or kicked out of office. The same Bob Creamer had visited Obama's White House 342 times, many of them for secret meetings. This basically is a meeting every week. In fact, when the list of White House visitors was leaked, there is no one on that list that comes close to this man's when it comes to visitation number. And to this date, White House has refused to provide the media with the reason this man was showing up in the White House, some of them for secret meetings. They just refused answering that question. This is the Bob Creamer we are talking about. Same thing with this woman. Now, you are going to see in these documents, Jan Schakowsky not only worked as a spy for the government of Israel with her handlers within AIPAC and JINSA, posing as a pro-Palestinian and gathering information and giving it to these lobby groups who then turned it into the country of Israel. But this same woman, this same Jan Schakowsky and her husband as well, have been grooming and working with terrorist mullah, the fanatic mullah Fethullah Gulen. Just take a look at the list of all the events that she's the speaker of, she's the sponsor of, the letters she has written praising Fethullah Gulen, his charter schools, Fethullah Gulen's financial headquarters is in Chicago, it's in Illinois. And it has been involved with many operations, including money laundering, narcotics, which we have already listed in the past through Newsbud and before that Boiling Frogs Post. But this woman, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, as you will see, and her husband, along with AIPAC and JINSA, have been the biggest supporters and part of the network of this terrorist mullah Fethullah Gulen. I also want to emphasize how the top criminals get immunity in Congress with ethics investigation, etc., such as Dennis Hastert was. Dennis Hastert was a wrestling coach, and he didn't have any other businesses. His wife didn't have any other businesses. By the time he left Congress, his net worth was over $30 million that he made through briberies and kickback, etc. But even though some of these were once in a while covered by the media, you never saw ethics investigation, really the major one, real ones against Dennis Hastert. You're going to witness the same thing with this other top criminal who happens to be Democrat. And this is Jan Schakowsky. I give you one example, and this is not a claim that I'm making. It's actually published by Chicago Tribune and by Daily Herald, okay? This woman is the congressperson, a representative, who has accepted more favored trips by outside party, foreign trips, than any other person in Congress. In fact, when they put the number of years, I think it's like 7 years period, outside influences they have paid $200,000 worth of trip for this criminal Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. Many of trips included her husband. He's not a congressman. These were not even junkets, right? And she has, despite these revelations, she has never been brought before any ethics committee investigations or covered by any other media outlets. Now, I want you to compare this to this case of another representative who's, I guess, not as high-level criminal as Janet Schakowsky. His name is Representative Peter Ruscombe, okay? Peter Ruscombe accepted foreign travel payments from outside influences, lobby groups, foundations, NGOs, etc., that was worth $78,000 for the same time period, okay? So rightfully, they put this guy before the ethics investigation, the ethics committee in Congress, and they made so much publicity out of it. The same investigation actually exposed Jan Schakowsky, criminal Jan Schakowsky, okay, with $200,000 versus Ruscombe's $80,000, to be exact, $78,000, right? No ethics investigations, no media coverage. It's very similar to Dennis Hastert, and that goes a long way showing you how much partnership there is when it comes to covering up the truth from the American public, the partnership between the mainstream media and especially the left supposed so-called alternative media funded by Soros and other individuals like Soros, okay? Just take a look at this. Why would they go about not publicizing it, no investigation, and yet someone who's a small-time crook? So big-time crooks get immunity, they become untouchable. You are looking at a woman who's a spy for at least one government. You're looking at a woman who was partner of her husband who got jailed for embezzling $3 million from the Americans. And even though her signature was under all those fraudulent paper, Jan Schakowsky, all she had to do, this criminal congresswoman, was to say, I signed those, but I had no idea he was engaged in embezzlement. I didn't know he was carrying out those activities. Well, she didn't get divorced. And just the fact that despite her signature, it's my signature, yes, I signed those, I am his partner, but I didn't know he was embezzling the Americans. And guess what? The establishment told him, okay, that's good enough. In fact, Bob Creamer, right after all these things were leaked about his secret visits to White House 342 times, more than any other outside government individuals, he had another fiasco with this video he put out there where he is telling people he's going to hire them and pay them for violent protests against Trump. And you can see the video footage here. And here are publications exposing this criminal Bob Creamer as the 340 times visitor of Obama's White House, and also as a man plotting and paying and hiring so-called demonstrators, not organic demonstrators, to bring about violent anti-Trump protests. And I also would want to pause here for 1 second and emphasize the importance. There's so much there to investigate for any major media outlets that have the resources. Of course, we all know they are not going to do. In fact, that's the reason we are here. That is the reason I started Boiling Frogs Post in 2008. And now we are doing it in a larger scale. Still, we are a very tiny operation as Newsbud. Because after going through my case, the court, my testimonies, Congress, and as I said, seeing that, and it doesn't only apply to my case, so many other legit whistleblowers, truth tellers have gone through that, how all of that had been blocked by the US media and was the biggest factor, the main motivation behind starting this news organization. It was to say, okay, they are not going to cover, they have never covered, they are actually in partnership with the criminals. They are actually, their purpose is to cover up, it's not to expose, it's the opposite of what it's supposed to be. Then the next logical question was what to do about it. And the answer for that was become your own media. And that's why I have been doing what I have been doing for the past 9 years now. There's so much to be covered. You don't have to have access to those 5,000 plus documents gathered by Chicago's Field's office on criminal Janice Tchaikovsky, Congresswoman Tchaikovsky, who's a U.S. representative. This criminal, like Hastert, is another representative who should be behind bars, and her husband. You don't have to have access to all those 5,000 documents. There is so much that can be dug up and exposed on this duo. All it takes is the will and the desire to expose the truth, to let the Americans know. Just the connection between this woman and her husband and Fethullah Gulen is very interesting. You also are going to see this. As I have always repeatedly said, Chicago, the state of Illinois, has been the center, whether it's money laundering or narcotics, and for the Operation Gladio B. Look at where Fethullah Gulen, this terrorist mullah, has based most of his operations. The arteries of this mullah's operation is in Chicago, it's in Illinois. And guess who else is a big supporter of this mullah and his network? Recently, I came across a picture of Rahm Emanuel, the man who is connected to the same mob and mafia as Jan Tchaikovsky and Bob Kramer and Governor Blagojevich and Mayor Daley and Tony Rasko. This same man, here is his picture. He has been working and supporting the same terrorist mullah network. You see this picture here? That is Rahm Emanuel from Chicago. Obama from Chicago. Tchaikovsky from Chicago. Dennis Hastert from Chicago. Do you need more? Look, the same thing happened, very similar case with my expose and my testimony and my revelation on then the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. In 2005, I provided information to Vanity Fair's investigative reporter. His name was David Rose. And later, as an investigative reporter, he had to go and gather other legitimate witnesses who would and could corroborate what I had testified on Dennis Hastert. And this is 2004, 2005. And he did. Because when you're looking at a mainstream media outlet like Vanity Fair, they have a major, big legal department. They don't want to be sued, okay? So they are very cautious on, if it's the government, their source, let's say a high-level official in Pentagon, that's good. Their word is kosher. Their word is good as gold. They don't need any other documents or witnesses. However, if it's a truth teller, if it's a government whistleblower, an outsider with information on the insiders, then the rules change. You have to show documentation. You have to bring in at least 2-3 witnesses. And in fact, if it's possible, those witnesses have to be high-ranking, let's say special agent in charge. Well, in this case with Vanity Fair, the investigative reporter, David Rose, actually spent almost a year, and he found other special agents within the FBI, former and current, people in congressional offices, and officials within Justice Department who corroborated my claims on Dennis Hastert. So they came out in September 2005, Vanity Fair with 2 million plus circulation. They published a 6-7 page article. Here this woman is sticking her neck and testifying against one of the most powerful men in this country, Dennis Hastert. Now, granted, they were cautious. They said, their legal department, not the journalists involved, they said, okay, we can talk about his criminal operations involving money laundering and foreign influence, but the information you and other witnesses gave on Dennis Hastert, pedophile activities in both his townhouse with his chief of staff, Scotty, in Washington, D.C., in the townhouse and offices and the flats over offices that he had in Illinois, and how they were delivering young boys, ages 14, 15. Some of these people were foreign entities. How these were videotaped. How FBI was in possession of these videotapes. They didn't want to include those. They thought it was too explosive, and they didn't want to touch it. It was not due to the fact that we didn't give them. But even with that, or despite that, this was a damning piece written on the most powerful man, Speaker of the House. There was this uniform blackout on Dennis Hastert case by all the other media outlets, alternative or mainstream. Then 4 years later, I testified under oath during Krikorian deposition. And I went into even more details. You are going to see the video. I'm talking about nefarious sexual activities that he carried out, the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, under oath.
It also appears that you have a photograph of Dennis Hastert in the gallery?
Yes.
Okay, and why is his photograph there?
Again, this information is public, has been public. Mm-hmm. It's he would be one of the primary U.S. persons involved in operations and activities that are not legal, and they're not for the interest of the United States, but for the interest of foreign governments and foreign entities.
And that was blacked out completely intentionally. We had press release on these. And yet, people come back 2 years ago, it becomes public. It is on top of every single newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post, that he's being indicted because he was giving hush money to some of the boys he raped. This came out 10 years after I gave this information to mainstream media. Do you know how many other boys this man raped? The minors he raped between 2005 and 2015. Do you know that he could have been indicted and jailed based on all evidence gathered by the FBI, all evidence I had provided to various mainstream media outlets? This man would have been indicted and jailed in 2005, 2006. People coming and saying, how do you feel, Sibel? You exposed all this in 2005. 10 years later, you were proved right. And I'm going to tell you how I feel about this. But let me give you another example that is very similar. If you go back to that State Secrets Gallery, you're going to see the name Graham Fuller. When I put his name out there, when I told reporters to go and where to go to investigate this guy, everybody, even the general public, they're like, he's a nobody. We've never heard of Graham Fuller. He's some mid-level CIA guy, but nothing really significant about him. Again, it took another 6-7 years for Graham Fuller's name to become a household name. His name surfaced with the Boston Marathon bombing case. He was related to the father or the uncle of the Tsarnaev brothers. And the fact that the uncle that we got to watch on CNN over and over again was living in a house that belonged to him without paying rent. Coincidences, if you want to believe? Well, how about this? When I exposed Fethullah Gülen, nobody had heard of the name Mullah Fethullah Gülen, 2007, 2008, 2009. Well, Fethullah Gülen now is a household name in the United States. But he could have been exposed much earlier had people furthered this. And by people, I mean the mainstream media. I'm talking about those so-called governmental entities that are in charge of persecuting, prosecuting, jailing real criminals, which they never do. Well, Graham Fuller, and you will see it here, you will see it here, you will see the documentation here. He is the man who sponsored Fethullah Gülen's green card. In fact, he's the man who groomed Fethullah Gülen, this mullah, before he even came to the United States. He was in Turkey grooming him in the early 90s. And now he is almost a household name. So now back to Jan Schakowsky. Do we need to wait for another 10 or 15 years? Maybe by then they will be even dead, natural death, for heinous criminal operation. This woman holding a public office is involved in, and her husband, who has been in the White House 342 times, secret meetings. Do we have to wait just like Dennis Hastert for 10 years for some media outlet to decide, well, they're dead or they're almost dead, let's put it out? Or are we going to see people demanding, pushing for it, and be loud enough about it that would force some of those imposters posing as media, who happen to be these criminal government's partners in cover-up, to actually get off their ass and do what they are supposed to be doing? Do we really need to wait for that? And with this, I'm going to repeat what I issued in 2009. And that is, if you're listening to me, you charlatan woman who is occupying currently a congressional office, my statement, my pledge, my offer still stands. I, Sibel Edmonds, am willing to stand on the floor of Congress, open hearing, open to the public, none of your closed hearing stuff, under oath, and I will release every detail about your criminal activities and your husband's Bob Creamer. I would name the file. In fact, I know people who can release documents, okay? I would name the dates. I would name the offices. I would put them all out under oath, and I'd be damned or jail if I'm lying. And you do the same, come under oath and deny it in front of those people in that building whose office you have been abusing. And same thing goes for my polygraph offer. I'm willing to take it by an independent polygraph. I know it's not 100% exact science, but I'm willing to take it. Will you be taking it? And to the American USA media, are you going to feel some shame and accept responsibility? Because if not now, when?
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.